Terminating Treatment, based on the essay Killing and Allowing to Die by Daniel Callahan, presentation by Emma the Earthquake. The main argument in Callahan's essay is there is a distinction between killing and allowing to die, the distinction with the intent to separate death that is caused by another human and death caused by the natural external world. Where should the blame be placed? In Callahan's essay, he raises an initial objection that the intent is more important than the actual action of killing or allowing to die. In James Rachel's Passive and Active Euthanasia that we read for class, he raises this objection using two hypothetical examples. The first, an uncle who is standing to benefit from his nephew's death, drowns his nephew, and in the second situation, the uncle sees his nephew drowning and does not do anything, allowing him to die. Rachel's argues that the motive in common makes the man in both situations guilty. Callahan argues that the distinction between killing and allowing to die is still valid, and the distinction makes the placing of blame more clear with the help of three overlapping perspectives. The first perspective is the metaphysical perspective. The key premise to this perspective is there is an important distinction between the self and the external world. The world we perceive is not a projection of our inner selves, and we do not have control over everything that happens in the world or that impacts us. The world outside of the self has its own causal dynamism. To err in categorizing killing and allowing to die as one and the same is to assume that man has full control over every event in the world, that man can play God because he has control over if someone dies or not, over nature's course. Although man is able to impact nature and perhaps enough to change the course of it temporarily, as is the case with vaccines and medical treatment in the field of medicine, we cannot stop disease from existing, time from aging us, or death from overtaking us, or all other organisms on the planet. We may be able to delay death, but in the end, it always overcomes, which man has no control over. Just as man can build earthquake-safe buildings, but cannot stop Emma the Earthquake from shaking the earth. The second perspective Callahan introduces is the moral perspective. The key premise of the moral perspective is the comparison of physical causality and moral culpability. These two concepts are used to place responsibilities on people or disease of a person's death. Physical causality is an act of human agency. Moral culpability is like saying moral responsibility. So if Joe, for example, intentionally poisoned Mike's coffee, resulting in organ failure and ultimately killing Mike, then Joe is morally culpable through his direct action of killing Mike. However, there are many more ambiguous cases of moral culpability. Continuing with the previous example, if Sally recognized that Mike was poisoned and didn't act to save his life and prevent the total organ failure by taking him to the hospital, which was possible, then Sally would also be morally culpable. This is where the line is blurred, as someone can be just as morally responsible for killing another person if they know they could be saved, yet allow them to die. A common case of these lines crossing is with ventilation machines for patients who are no longer able to perform fundamental biological functions such as breathing. Here I agree with Callahan, in the opinion that turning off the respirator, which is our action that would end the patient's life, we would not be morally culpable for his death because the death would ultimately be from the disease that caused the need for the artificial respirator. The blame for the death would be the disease. This connects directly back to the metaphysical perspective that man cannot control the dynamism of nature, nature's course, or the overall outcome of death, especially with disease. A third and final perspective is the medical perspective. The key premise from this point of view is that the cessation of treatment that leads to cessation of suffering and welcoming death is not the greatest human evil. The distinction between killing and allowing to die has historically served to protect the reputations of physicians as one who would cure and comfort patients rather than kill. With all the knowledge physicians are given, Callahan argues that it is important to set limits to the power that comes with the knowledge and privileges of medical practice. The physician's primary purpose to comfort and cure patients of disease, however, patient's autonomy trumps all else. If a patient wishes to cease treatment, the physician must comply, even if it means the patient will die. Behind the premise is the idea that death is not necessarily always the greatest human evil, and death ultimately overtakes. To demand continual treatment and for the physician to continue to fight the disease would be falling into the same metaphysical trap between assuming that man has ultimate power over the external world.